Do you have an independent mind? If so, I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just click on the subscribe button, ring that little bell, and stay up to date with my daily content. Thank you. Hey, I want to talk causation. Specifically, I want to talk causation in the context of the Derek Chauvin trial, which is now reaching a milestone. The prosecution resting its case. They took 2 full weeks to present all of their witnesses. It was at times emotional. It was methodical. I thought in general, it was very well presented. I think that they've put on a very compelling case, a case that will be most difficult to refute, at least on the issue of excessive force. And by that I mean that if Derek Chauvin has any shot at a hung jury, and of course it would take just one juror not to go along with his or her colleagues on that jury, one can hang that jury, or if he has any opportunity for an outright acquittal, which I think is a very minimal opportunity, it's going to be based on causation. And I said this briefly on CNN on Saturday. I was interviewing Earl Gray. Earl Gray represents police officer Thomas Long. He's one of the other 3 officers who will face charges in connection with the death of George Floyd. He's charged with aiding and abetting, meaning aiding and abetting Chauvin, as Chauvin was engaged in excessive force that killed George Floyd. If, by the way, Chauvin should be acquitted, again, which I think is a very minimal possibility, but if Chauvin were to be acquitted, then those other cases presumably go away. You're not going to be able to try the other 3 cops successfully if you couldn't convict Chauvin as a practical matter. Anyway, I said some of this on CNN on Saturday, and it drew an enormous social media reaction. Many people understanding what I was saying, but many people not understanding what I was saying and taking issue with what they thought I was saying. Everybody wants to read in, as if they really know what you're thinking. I'm very transparent. I wear it on my sleeve. What was I thinking? I was thinking, this Chauvin case is a pretty strong case. And if he has any opportunity, it's only going to be on causation. Well, Sonia was among those who took issue with me and said, for heaven's sake, Smirkanish, why are we overthinking the obvious? The truth is out there for everyone to see, and we've seen it aplenty. Chauvin murdered George Floyd, period. Let me try and break this down, because I said in my brief and maybe persnickety reply to her that I was really trying to do a public service of sorts. The expectation is such in the public that this is a slam dunk. And of course, Derek Chauvin will be found guilty probably of murder. And I worry about what will be the reaction all across the country if, in fact, that's not the way that it goes. I'm not predicting that Chauvin gets off. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to analyze how the jury will be instructed and what might be the possible outcomes in this case. Derek Chauvin is facing 3 charges. Second-degree unintentional murder. Second-degree unintentional murder is the most serious of them. It requires a showing beyond a reasonable doubt that Chauvin caused Floyd's death while assaulting him. It carries with it a sentence of 10 3/4 to 15 years. Okay? Second-degree unintentional murder. Third-degree murder is perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others, evincing a depraved mind without regard for human life. Same possible sentence, 10 3/4 to 15 years. What's a depraved mind? Nobody really knows. And the law does a poor job of defining exactly what that is. What is the difference? Here's another question. What's the difference between a depraved mind and the form or sort of culpable negligence that's required for manslaughter? That's also murky. And manslaughter is, second-degree manslaughter, the third charge that Chauvin faces. The requirement here is to show the prosecution beyond a reasonable doubt that he was culpably negligent and took an unreasonable risk. What does that carry? That carries 41 to 57 months. Let's call it 3.5 years, okay, as a minimum sentence. So those are the three charges that Derek Chauvin is facing. And you can really break this down into two component parts. One is there's got to be a showing, a convincing to that jury that the force was excessive. And on that score, you've had a number of witnesses. You had Sergeant Jody Steiger from Los Angeles. He's the conventional expert witness who said that there was excessive force, who responded to the question, do you have an opinion within a reasonable degree of, I don't know exactly what the word choice was, policing, certainty, supervisory certainty, as to whether Derek Chauvin used excessive force with regard to, yes, I do. And what is your opinion? My opinion is within a reasonable degree of certainty that Derek Chauvin's use of force was excessive. They had that. That's what you've got to have. And typically in a case like this, you would have an expert for the prosecution, and then you'll have an expert for the defense. And the question will be, sir, madam, do you have an opinion within a reasonable? Yes, I have a reasonable. And what is your opinion? My opinion is that there was no excessive force, that Derek Chauvin used an appropriate level of force. Normally, it's a battle of experts, but what's unique in this case is that you also had other police testimony from within the Minneapolis Police Department. You had blue on blue in this case. You had Chief Arredondo, who said that he should have stopped. Chauvin should have stopped. You had Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman. I think his emphasis is on the man, the most senior police officer in Minneapolis. And he said the use of force was uncalled for. You had Supervisory Sergeant David Plager, who said Chauvin should have ended the restraint. Do you remember Plager? Plager was the very first witness in this trial was a woman who works for the 911 dispatch. She's the one who was involved in taking one of the calls, as I recall. This part I remember for sure. She had the ability to watch on a fixed camera at that intersection because it's a high crime area, and they had a fixed camera, and she had the opportunity to watch, and what she was seeing troubled her. And she called Sergeant Plager and used the word snitch, something like, hey, I don't want to be a snitch, but this isn't right. So he was called to testify. That's just like 3 out of, I think there were 6 fellow officers within the department who said that the use of force in some combination of language, the use of force was excessive. I think they meet the burden on excessive force. Whether it's second-degree murder, third-degree murder, manslaughter, I don't know. But I think they get home on that basis. The defense is going to have an expert, but I think it'll be very difficult for them to rebut the excessive force evidence, which is the videotape, and the testimony that corresponds with it. Okay, now we get to the second hurdle for the prosecution, which is causation. The prosecution says that George Floyd died of a lack of oxygen. A lack of oxygen because Chauvin was on his neck. I mean, in very simple terms, that's what they're saying. The defense says, wait a minute, he died of a heart attack, cardiac arrest, because of all the drugs in his system and the underlying issues that he had. He died of a lack of oxygen because the knee was on his neck. No, he died of a heart attack because he was on drugs and he had a lot of things going on inside his body. Floyd did have cardiovascular disease. That's come out. Severe blockage in an artery, high blood pressure, fentanyl, methamphetamine in his system. A key witness was last Friday. It was the medical examiner. It was Andrew Baker. He performed the autopsy. Interestingly, he testified, like arguably he was the most important witness, and yet I think he was on the stand for 50 minutes. His conclusion, quote, cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. Okay, that's what he says was the cause of death. He also listed hardening and thickening of the artery walls, heart disease, and drug use as quote unquote other significant conditions. He did not cite a lack of oxygen or asphyxia, a cause that was found by other prosecution witnesses. And I don't know, how much of this just washed over the jury, because it's so easy to hear so much that you lose that which is really significant. What I thought was really significant is that when he was asked on cross-examination whether George Floyd died of asphyxiation, Baker, the medical examiner, said, quote, that's something we don't really see. Pressure to the back of the neck resulting in strangulation. Now, there was another medical examiner, Lindsay Thomas, who worked with Baker previously, who said differently, in this case, I believe the primary mechanism of death is asphyxia or low oxygen. Again, the medical examiner who did the autopsy did not conclude that asphyxia or low or lack of oxygen was the cause of death. That's important. The pulmonology expert, Dr. Martin Tobin, the guy who spoke with the Irish brogue, if you've been paying attention, he was on the witness stand for a lot longer than Baker was, had a very good sort of approachable, I thought, demeanor with that jury. He said, in contrast to the medical examiner, that it was a lack of oxygen. In other words, he agreed with Lindsay Thomas, I know this is confusing, the other medical examiner. Quote, Floyd died from a low level of oxygen. This caused damage to the brain that we see, and it also caused pulseless electrical activity arrhythmia that caused his heart to stop. So when you really get into the weeds, there is a difference between what the pulmonology hired, even though he didn't charge, the sort of conventional expert, Tobin, what he said, and what the guy who performed the autopsy, Baker, said. The difference being, was it arrhythmia or lack of oxygen that killed George Floyd? And the medical examiner said no. None of the charges require proving Chauvin was trying to kill George Floyd. Again, second-degree unintentional murder, that requires a showing that the death took place while George Floyd was being assaulted by Derek Chauvin. Third-degree murder, perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others, evincing a depraved mind without regard for human life. And then you've got second-degree manslaughter, which is culpable negligence that an unreasonable risk was taken. I mean, look, I think at a minimum, the jury, from a liability standpoint, would find culpable negligence, but I don't know how it plays in the community if, when all is said and done, Derek Chauvin is convicted of something for which he only does 3.5 years. I don't think that washes so well. So what final thing, and most important, so you get it, right? There's all this evidence and testimony about excessive force. Trying to pin it, the prosecution is, in one of those 3 criminal charges. And then you've got causation. I find the case to be compelling on excessive force. I'm simply pointing out that on causation, it gets a little more dicey. So how is the jury going to handle this issue? Professor Richard Frace at the University of Minnesota's Rabina Institute has something posted on his website pertaining to causation that I thought was a nice, tight summary of the issue. I'm going to read a 1-paragraph summary from this criminal law professor, and then I'll read to you what the actual proposed jury instruction is in Minnesota. And in light of everything I've described so far, just think about how the jury is going to process this information. First of all, from Professor Frace on causation, Each of the three homicide charges requires proof that Chauvin's actions were the factual and proximate cause of Floyd's death. Factual causation is shown if Chauvin's actions, kneeling on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes, were a substantial causal factor contributing to Floyd's death. This standard can be met even if other factors, for example, Floyd's alleged drug use and pre-existing heart condition, were also contributing factors in his death. The state must also prove that Chauvin's actions were the proximate cause of Floyd's death, that his death was not the direct result of some independent, intervening person's act or other factor that the defendant could not reasonably have foreseen. No such intervening cause seems to have been operating here, only the additional contributing causes that I've already noted. Confusing, right? Okay, here is what the jury will probably be read. I'm now about to read to you the Minnesota Criminal Jury Instruction Guide. This is section 3.31 on causation. So this is what I expect Judge Cahill will be reading to the jury as they are being sent off to deliberate in this case on the subject of causation. To cause, to proximately cause, means to be a substantial causal factor in causing the death. Think about this in the context of the knee on the neck. I'll start over. To cause, to proximately cause, means to be a substantial causal factor in causing the death. The defendant is criminally liable for all the consequences of his or her actions that occur in the ordinary and natural course of events, including those consequences brought about by one or more intervening causes, if such intervening causes were the natural result of the defendant's acts. The fact that other causes contribute to the death does not relieve the defendant of criminal liability. However, the defendant is not criminally liable if a superseding cause caused the death. A superseding cause is a cause that comes after the defendant's acts, alters the natural sequence of events, and produces a result that would not otherwise have occurred. That is a word salad. Yeah, man, that's where this whole thing is headed. That's where this whole thing is headed. And so it's not so black and white, is my point. It's just not so, everybody says things, like follow the law, just apply the law. Well, that's the law. That's what the jury will be instructed on the subject of causation when it's all said and done. A cause is a cause which has a substantial part in bringing about the occurrence at issue. A superseding cause is defined as other effects which come after the original occurrence and which turns aside the natural sequence of events and produces a result which would not otherwise have followed the original event. To cause, to proximately cause, means to be a substantial causal factor in causing the death. Was Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck a substantial causal factor in causing his death? In the end, that's what I think this all comes down to. I hope I haven't muddled the water, but I've done a fairly straightforward and organized job in trying to explain what really, we all watched the video. I'll say it this way, and then I'll stop. We all watched the video and were horrified by it. How the hell could he have kept his knee on that man's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, about 3 minutes of which, after Floyd had gone, his body had gone limp? And I know, I have the same reaction as everybody else. Appalling. There's got to be accountability. And then you start looking at it through the lens of the law, divided by excessive force and causation, and it gets a little more complicated for all the reasons I've just articulated.